and it is my esteemed privilege to welcome you all to this week's CCL training program, a weekly webinar of Citizens Climate Lobbies that provides CCL supporters like you and I with access to in-depth training opportunities on topics related to climate change and effective climate advocacy. I'll be your host tonight, Brett Cease, and tonight our topic is June 2024 lobby training on primary and secondary asks. We're going to be joined by CCL's Vice President of Government Affairs, Ben Pendergrass, and CCL's Senior Director of Government Affairs, Jenn for a training that will review the updates and context for our summer conference, June 2024 primary and supporting asks that will be engaging all members of Congress office on the Hill, as well as guidance for lobby teams as they plan their meetings. If we've done our job well in the hour ahead, we'll have the chance to discuss these primary asks and explore what policy goals they are accomplishing. We'll help review and understand the dynamics around their asks and why they're the focus of our lobby day in the month ahead. And we'll also make sure to review kind of which ones best align with which members of Congress in case some of that is helpful for context and preparations for each of you and your teams. Our agenda is pretty straightforward. We've got two main primary asks, so we'll kick off with both of those. After a brief introduction and review of the basics, we'll then talk through the secondary asks that we have for this June. And then we'll conclude with some final thoughts before getting to an ambitious Q&A and a reminder that we'll have even more Q&A time on Thursday. So tonight, if you don't get your question answered, make sure to come back Thursday, or we'll have lots of time built in for that there too. All right, so real quick before I pass it to you, Ben, there's some basic reminders. So basically, again, all trainings are posted on CCL's YouTube channel. The short link is just really easy to remember, cclusa.org/YouTube. You can also search for this training and find it as of tomorrow when we update it on CCL Community. Just type in the search bar primary and secondary asks page. It should be one of the top hits. And know that right now we actually are still in a dynamic Congress. So we haven't fully uploaded these to CCL Community, but we will do so by the end of the week. There's a couple of key details that you hear from Ben and Jen in a little bit. That is kind of the reason behind that it hasn't happened yet. We want to be nimble. But just know that tonight we are going to review what they are, at least so you can start those preparations. All right, so as far as the lobby meeting plans, Mindy wanted me to make sure to also remind everyone that we have the meeting plan template. It has been updated, and I, in the chat, am going to put a link for you that are knowing as liaisons or meeting leads the importance of coordinating that, those guidance documents, if it's helpful in your own preparations, especially as you get ready for your meetings. They walk you through some of the key items like appreciations, what the primary goal is for the meeting, some of the open-ended questions that you can consider. We've got a great training and resource on that already. And if you haven't thought through this, but you do know that you are not going to be in DC, but you want to, as the liaison, make sure that your team is aware of your recommendations. We've got that plan link where you can basically submit it ahead of time. And if you do that before the end of June 3rd, we'll make sure to get that to the team. So without further ado, though, thank you all so much again for being here. I'll put one last time a link in the chat where you can follow along with the slides, as well as where you can go after tonight to find out more information. And with that, I will pass it to you, Ben, to get us started on our primary asks.
Great. Thank you so much, Brett. And thank you all for joining us here tonight. You know, this is a super exciting time of year when we're getting ready to come back to DC and get in-person meetings, really walk the Hill. And as usual, you know, this June lobby day is going to be super timely. There's still a lot of stuff to get done this Congress. And so we're ready to go. Let's do it. I'm excited. As usual, we're going to talk about Prove It Act tonight and permitting reform. And let's let Jen lead us off talking a little bit about the Prove It Act and what we'll be talking about in June.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Ben. And I am so excited. I think I'm just most excited to see everyone in person. I feel like we connect so much over Zoom, but I cannot wait to see everyone in person and hit the Hill with you guys and go to those offices. I can't wait. So we'll talk about Prove It first. There's a Senate bill, S 1836, which you all are familiar with, but there's a forthcoming House bill, HR. We don't know yet. It hasn't been introduced, but we're expecting it to come out soon. So hopefully you all are familiar with this bill, but I'm going to kind of go through it in case you haven't worked on it yet. But we have endorsed this. We've already lobbied on this. This is a really exciting bill. It's a bipartisan bill that requires the Department of Energy to study greenhouse gas emissions intensity of certain products in the US and in other countries. So the bill selects certain products, and you'll think of some of them will sound familiar that are pretty emissions intensive. We're talking about aluminum, cement, oil, steel, those sorts of things. And it requires that data be collected on how emissions intense is producing those products. And that data not only goes for those products produced in the United States, but also those same products produced in other countries. And it's specific countries, and you'll figure out pretty easily why, but countries like China and other countries that have really emissions intense productions. So that's the overview of the bill. It requires us to gather this data on how intense are the greenhouse gas emissions of those products in the US compared to some of these other countries. The status of the bill, as I mentioned, there's already a Senate bill. It's been introduced by Senators Coons and Kramer in the Senate. And we actually had some really exciting advancement, and you guys were a big part of this. We lobbied for the bill. We got a bunch of co-sponsors on the bill, 12 co-sponsors right now in the Senate, 7 Democrats, 5 Republicans. And after all of that activity, we had it advanced through the Senate EPW committee in a really strong bipartisan vote of 14-5. And when you think of that, this is a climate bill. This is a climate and trade bill. Yes, it's got trade components, but it's nonetheless a climate bill. It's talking about emissions intensity. And the fact that we're able to have that many Republicans support it, to get it through committee, is a huge, huge show of how far our work has already gone to get these members on board. And we just got to keep hammering it home to try to get it through. So that's what's going on in the Senate. We've seen some movement. It hasn't passed the full Senate, just the committee. So we still got work to do there to get people to support it in the Senate and get it fully across. And in the House, we know that it is going to be introduced, hopefully in the coming weeks, by Representatives John Curtis out of Utah, who's a Republican, and Scott Peters, who's a Democrat out of California. So we've got a House bill coming. We got a Senate bill that's already moving, that hasn't gone all the way, and we need to keep it going. So diving more into why this bill. I mentioned, the whole purpose of the bill is collecting this data on emissions intensity. So we're getting all this data, and the point of that data is to be able to show that US industry is much cleaner and much more effective than some of our foreign competitors. And we really want to hold those competitors accountable. So this is going to allow us to use trade, to use this, in this case, emissions trade imbalance, as a tool to eventually bring down global emissions. So we want to show, we know it's true because we've seen some data, but we need the federal government to collect, very clear, concise data on just how clean our industry is compared to these foreign competitors. And that data is going to allow us to, in the long run, use trade as a tool and bring those global emissions down. But in addition to what it's going to do, the data, the specifics, you got to kind of take a step back with a bill like this. You might think, oh, it's just data, it's not that relevant. But the more members we're able to educate on the importance of this, the more members we're able to bring along and show that, hey, this is worth stepping out on. Getting involved, getting educated on emissions intensity, on industry, on climate and trade, those are all relevant topics. The more members we can bring along, the more people we're bringing into the fold, and we're able to get them into our climate coalition. We're able to get them down the road to do even more. In addition, I mentioned we've already had this move through the Senate. We've got a bunch of Republicans who are co-sponsors. We had a bunch more vote for the bill out of the committee. That bipartisan support is tremendously valuable, not just for this bill, but for all the other climate priorities we're working on, where we can show there is a bipartisan group, there is consensus on needing to take action on this in Congress and to get something done. So that bipartisan support, as important as it is for this specific bill, I can't overstate how significant that's going to be for all the things we want to do down the road. And as I mentioned, it's going to be introduced in the House shortly. So we've got something coming up really soon where we're going to see another House bill introduced, and we want to gin up that support on the House side. So really a timely ask for both the Senate bill, but of course the coming House bill, and a really important step in our overall strategy to kind of build this support for climate policy. So diving into exactly how do we frame this bill for different offices? I think pretty easily you'll tell by how I was describing it that we're collecting this data to show that American business, American industry is cleaner than our foreign competitors. That's clearly an argument that would appeal to almost everyone in Congress, right? We want to support US industry. We want to support US jobs, support the US economy, but that's particularly salient for Republican offices. So we do want to focus on that when we go into Republican offices. Focus on the fact that we know American industry is cleaner. This bill is going to give us the data to really prove that, and also to go to countries like China and show yours is really, really not clean. Your industry is really not clean. And to really right that emissions trade imbalance. So that is a really, really important argument for Republican offices. There's also a bunch of industry and conservative support already for this bill. API, CRES, the US Chamber of Commerce, the steel manufacturers all have endorsed this bill. And you can also highlight all the Republicans who are already co-sponsors or who voted for the bill in committee. So there's a bunch of support that's already out there that's conservative that would be worth highlighting if you're talking to a Republican office. As I mentioned, we want to talk about lowering global emissions, but we want to do that with Republicans highlighting that it's because American industry is cleaner. This bill is not aiming to put a cap on all global emissions. No, this bill is going to demonstrate that we are already doing it clean, and we want other countries to do the same thing. Now, this next part is really important. I want to stress it because we're talking to a bunch of different offices, especially on the Republican side. There's a lot of sensitivities you guys might know of. We don't want to tie this bill directly to a CBAM, to a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and we don't want to tie it to a carbon tariff or to a carbon price. We might have thoughts in the back of our heads, us knowing, kind of how these things go on and what might be happening all across the world right now with CBAMs. But these conversations we're having come June, we really just want to focus on this bill itself. So just focus on the importance of this data and the fact that it's going to demonstrate that American industry is cleaner. We don't want to get into the discussion on CBAMs or price on carbon because some offices are going to be really sensitive to that. So we just want to focus on exactly what's in front of us with Republicans and just talk about the merits of this specific bill. So for Republican office, the ask for Approve It is to ask them to become a Senate co-sponsor or an original co-sponsor in the House. So we want to build up that Republican support on the bill itself. For Democratic offices, the message, you can use the same message, I will say, that we used on Republicans, the importance of showing that American industry is cleaner. I don't think that's a bad message with any member. But we can really focus for Democratic offices on the fact that this bill will allow us in the future to use trade as a tool to lower greenhouse gas emissions. So you can really hit the climate aspect of this bill more so with Democratic offices. Again, I wouldn't necessarily go into CBAMs or carbon pricing, even with a Democratic office. But you can highlight the importance of climate and that this data is tremendously important for our active action on climate. We also want to highlight that it's tremendously bipartisan. There's a lot of support across industry, different environmental organizations, all across the board. And we want to highlight what we said originally. Part of why we picked this bill, part of the cherry on top, I'll say, with this bill is that it helps lay the groundwork for future climate action. We're building the coalition, we're bringing more people involved, we're collecting this important data that we can use down the road, and this is really setting us up for bigger things. The ask for Democratic offices in the Senate, we want to ask them to urge leadership to support moving the bill this Congress. So for Senate Democrats, the ask is not necessarily to co-sponsor, but instead to talk to leadership and tell them, hey, put this bill on the floor. It's already moved through Senate committee, let's get it done. The reason we're not asking Senate Democrats to co-sponsor necessarily is because in the Senate, we know they're trying to add more Republicans. So we don't want a bunch of Senate Democrats asking to co-sponsor when they might not be added. But instead, talking to leadership, given that it's already through committee, and telling Senate leadership, let's move this all the way across through the Senate. So that's the ask for Senate Democrats. For House Democrats, because the bill is forthcoming and we want to make sure it's introduced with a really strong list of Republicans and Democrats in the House, the ask for House Democrats is for them to be original co-sponsors on the bill. So a little different just for Senate Democrats. Senate Democrats is the only group we're not necessarily asking to co-sponsor, we're asking them to talk to Senate leadership. but all other groups, both House and Senate Republicans and House Democrats, we're asking them to co-sponsor the bill. So with that, that is all on Prove It. I'm sure we'll have time for some questions on it, but I'll turn things over to Ben to get into permitting reform.
Great. Let's talk permitting reform. Thanks for that, Jen. That was really helpful. But there's one other thing that we lobbied on last Congress that we're still working on, and that's permitting reform. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that progress has been made in a lot of different ways on permitting reform since last June. However, stuff still needs to get done. And just right off the bat, our top line message to Congress is they still need to take action on a comprehensive package. Let's review for a second, like why we've been focused on permitting reform. Well, one, it does a lot to drive down carbon pollution by speeding up the approval of clean energy projects. There's just no way we hit our emissions reductions targets unless we start to build a lot of clean energy infrastructure fast. And right now, we're simply not building it fast enough to meet any of our objectives. We got to do better, and Congress is going to play a big role in this. And as we do this, we want to make sure we do it in a way that continues to protect the health and safety of American people and communities and preserves community engagement and is not just a rubber stamp to build things. But as I always say, we want to get to a yes on good projects faster and a no on bad projects faster. That's better for everybody and certainly better for the climate. So let's talk a little bit about when I said like a lot has been accomplished. Well, we've been advocating for a lot of things, and some things have happened that are going to allow transmission to be permitted and built faster. There's some stuff that Congress and the administration have done that will reduce the time to complete environmental reviews. Action has been taken to avoid duplicative processes and have done things like designate a lead agency. And a lot has been done to continue to ensure robust and early community engagement. There's still a lot of things that haven't gotten done, though. Judicial review has not been touched. Even though some transmission planning stuff has been addressed, interregional transmission planning has not. Minimum transfer requirements, like we've lobbied on for in the bill Big Wires, have not been addressed. And Congress still has not done or gotten done stuff around technology-specific permitting reforms that are needed for specific technologies like hydropower, like geothermal, like nuclear power. So let's think a little bit about how it got done. As these things there has been a lot of momentum in Congress post-IRA. We and others identified the need for this pretty quick, and even in some cases before the IRA was passed, that this was going to be one of the next big barriers to building clean energy infrastructure. And so we started making the case in Congress. Even before last June, we were talking about it. We've done things like help the House Climate Solutions Caucus to circulate a letter that ended up getting 24 signatures from 12 Republicans and 12 Democrats calling for bipartisan permitting reform. Some permitting reform stuff was included in the debt ceiling. These were the reforms to streamline NEPA, study the capacity of transmission, and other things. And these are that debt ceiling reform package. That's what honestly spurred a lot of the executive administrative action you've been seeing in the last couple of weeks, these federal rules that have been coming out. And so now, as part of this congressional and grassroots desire and industry desire to improve permitting reform, several major agencies and FERC rules have been finalized in the last couple of weeks. They've been coming fast and furious for about the last 4 or 5 weeks. You might have seen this, that are making it easier to permit clean energy infrastructure. So let's take a brief look at those. Now, I will say, we're just going to cover, we could talk for a long time about all the new rules. I think there's a new webinar every day in Washington, D.C. explaining these rules. So if you want to get more in depth on these rules, we invite you to visit Community. Our research coordinator, Dan Nuccitelli, has put together a broad overview of all the recent rulemaking. And so if you want to do a deep dive, please see Dana's page. I think we'll post that link in the chat. All right, so First, what are these new rules? Well, one of the first important ones is the Council on Environmental Quality Rule. These are the rules that really implement what was in the debt ceiling deal. They like lay out the real more details for how agencies will implement what was in the debt ceiling deal. And they do things like direct agencies to consider the effects of climate change in their environmental reviews of energy projects. It establishes a lead agency for permitting projects that involve multiple agencies. It sets page limits for environmental reviews and specifies clear timelines for those reviews. There was also a lot of language around earlier and more meaningful community involvement in the federal permitting process. The other rule that directly affects some of this stuff is there was also a Department of Energy rule that allows the DOE to designate certain areas as national interest electric transmission corridors. I'm just going to call them national corridors because that's a lot. And that directly impacts the next rule we're going to talk about. These are the new FERC rules that were just adopted last Monday. There were two rules. First, there was Order number 1977. This establishes that FERC has the authority to issue permits to construct transmission lines in those national interest corridors if a state has denied signing an application or failed to take action. One of the things we know that has been a big issue on transmission, which transmission is such a key part of getting clean energy infrastructure built and projects online and lowering our emissions. This now means that right now states can, if one state doesn't agree for a multi-state transmission line, it basically blocks the process indefinitely. Now, if it's in one of these corridors, FERC can take over the permitting authority after 1 year. So this is a major victory. And in this process, it also requires that transmission project developers create community and tribal engagement plans. This has been a big win, but I should point out that this is a long time coming because this particular provision directing FERC to do this was originally included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So this is one of those things where we saw congressional action that we supported 2 years ago, and now it's finally getting implemented in a real way. The next FERC rule, this is Rule Order 1920. This requires electrical transmission providers to take several important steps to improve regional transmission capabilities, not interregional, regional. This includes long-term planning over a 20-year horizon, which is really important to be thinking not in the short term, but what are our needs 20 years down the road, and thinking about climate and reliability and resiliency are all things they need to think about. Another great thing about this particular rule is it addresses GITs, otherwise known as these technologies that can be grid enhancing technologies that can, in low cost ways, make the grid better, make it easier to get more clean energy on there. It requires them to look at those things. And the biggest and most controversial part of the rule, though, is it establishes a cost allocation requirement to be determined how you pay for high voltage lines when running across multiple regions. This has always been a big sticking point when they build these big transmission projects, is who pays for them. And FERC has finally laid out a rule. It has not necessarily made everybody happy. There's some concern that some rural states might pay more for projects that benefit some more urban states. So there are some controversies around this, but that cost allocation is something that needs to get done. All right, let's go back to what still does need to get done since we had all these rules and this progress made and why we're still talking about permitting reform. One, we need to make sure interregional transmission is permitted and built faster. Right now, there's the national corridors, and FERC has that backstop authority, but there's still some other issues, and there's still needs the emphasis to do some of this stuff. We still need the technology-specific permitting reforms, like I said, nuclear, hydropower, geothermal. Judicial review is still needed to be reformed. Right now, we've kind of touched on some of the permitting processes, but projects can still be litigated for a very long time after these reviews have been performed. So now we've shortened the time period for NEPA reviews. Now we need to think about, can we really litigate? If a project is being litigated for 10 years, are you really building infrastructure faster? And of course, we want to make sure reforms continue to include good, durable community engagement processes. And one of the things we've seen with any rule is, and this goes to both the community processes and building things faster, is if it's just administrative action, if it's just FERC action, things might not necessarily be durable. Congress still needs to move forward and take on these things and have a comprehensive package that can't be overturned by a future administration. So really, our goal is not a specific bill. It's to tell Congress that the job is not done, and a bipartisan comprehensive package on clean energy reforms are still needed. There are going to be some offices that are like, you know what, we've done enough. We've made great strides. We're going to get more clean energy on the grid just with these reforms. We don't need to touch anything else. And there's pretty wide bipartisan agreement that that's not the case. But members of Congress still needs to hear there's a grassroots climate advocate desire to keep going. And so that's what we're going to tell them. All right, let's get into some of the framing. You know, for Republicans, you can admit that progress has been made and acknowledge that. But one thing that's really important to be aware of is that while Republicans support some of the rules, particularly the portions that were directly part of the debt ceiling deal, that as Republicans support. The FERC backstop authority, because it was part of that bipartisan infrastructure bill 2 years ago, that hasn't drawn much fire. But there's some other parts that they feel like the agencies or the administration have overstepped what was congressional intent. They're not necessarily like happy about that. That's just something you should really be aware of when you're going into your meetings, that the delight with some of these things is not universal, even though we're pretty pleased with most of them. And one of the things to think about is there's still, in like providing motivation to keep going, there's still many long-term Republican goals on permitting that's not yet accomplished. I mean, judicial review has been something that is bipartisan, but has really been on the Republican radar for a really long time. So reminding them that that's not yet done, reminding them that some of the things that have passed in a big way in a bipartisan fashion around nuclear permitting have not gotten done. So there's a reason to stay at the table and keep negotiating. And like I said, you know, one thing to point out to Congress is if they want changes that are long lasting, the only durable way is to take congressional action. Even if they say, like, you know, we might have the administration and the presidency next go around and we'll get done what we want to get done. Well, then the following administration can just undo those changes as well. And you get this seesaw effect between Democrats and Republicans, that it goes back and forth, back and forth. And it's not good for industry. It's not good for the climate. And so if they really want to get things done, Congress needs to do it and not just rely on executive action. For Democrats, you really want to point out, like, we want to applaud everything that's happened, but we want to make sure they understand that even with the positive actions and the new rules we've gotten in the last 5 weeks, it's not enough. It's not going to get the transmission build out we need. It's not going to provide the impetus to get this done in a timely manner. It certainly has made it easier than it was a year ago. Things will get built faster and easier, but not at the rate we still need. One thing that I think is always really important to point out to offices is renewable energy and transmission projects are currently litigated at a higher rate than any other infrastructure projects. Like, that's a big deal, and it's clearly hurting clean energy getting on the grid and lowering our emissions. And what we want to really make sure that they understand is don't just declare victory. Permitting continues to be a major obstacle to building clean energy infrastructure. And if we just stop now, while we're in a better place than we were a year ago, we won't be where we need to be. With that, I will turn it over to Jen to kind of start talking a little bit about the secondary asks. And you should say that, you know, we're placing more emphasis on these primary asks than the secondary asks this year, because there's a lot there just with permitting reform and Prove It Act.
Yeah, great. So yeah, definitely the bulk of your meetings are going to be focused on the Prove It Act and permitting reform. But hopefully these secondary asks are a moment where you can kind of catch your breath and take a step out of the weeds from those more complicated issues. And we use these secondary asks as a way to not only get things done on climate, but also have more progress, get more people involved, and get wins on the board that'll help us knock down some of those bigger challenges. So first, I want to highlight that this is successful for us. Our secondary asks, we've been incredibly successful in getting them passed through both chambers, signed into law. So we've recently had the Growing Climate Solutions Act passed. If you've been with us, you remember the BEST Act, the Use It Act, Climate Ready Fisheries. There have been a number of secondary asks that we've gotten to move, and those are the ones that have been signed into law, but there's a bunch that we've gotten able to move, and obviously a handful there across the finish line, which is tremendous. And as I mentioned, these smaller victories make it easier for us to hit our bigger goals. So they're important in and of themselves, but ultimately getting people on board, getting people to vote for these bills, it makes them more likely to take larger steps in the future on climate. How do we decide what's a secondary ask and what isn't? Because I know many of you have bills that your member introduced that you really love, and honestly, there's a bunch that are great to pick from. But some of the criteria we use, we want to make sure it's a part of, or it's really complementary to, one of our primary policy areas. So natural climate solutions, forestry, permitting reform, carbon pricing. We focus on the things we're already working on, the areas we're already working. What are some of the smaller nuggets in those areas we can work on? We also want to make sure it's bipartisan. We talk about that with our primary asks as well, wanting to, as much as we can, focus on things that are going to get consensus and find common ground to move forward. We also want to make sure that it's able to move. Can it be achieved in the near term? We're not, these secondary asks are not as much these larger goals that might take, many years or many Congresses to build the support. We're hoping these are kind of smaller, more tangible, more narrow, focused bills that already have momentum, but there's a gap there. There's a grassroots gap that we want to fill, that we want to fill and get it across the finish line. And lastly, we want to make sure we're building bridges with these bills, not necessarily creating more divisions or highlighting things. Again, even though these bills in and of themselves are important, they reduce emissions, they impact climate. The bigger goal, I will say, is to make sure we're bringing people along, supporting our coalition, growing our coalition to get our bigger goals accomplished. So we want to work on bills that are really going to build those bridges, bring people in, instead of highlighting any sort of divisions or creating more divisions that would be harmful to our larger goals. So that's a little bit about how we decide, and I'll turn it over to Ben to talk about our specific secondary asks this June.
Hey, so like I said, this June we have 2 secondary asks, and both of these fall within the Healthy Forest Policy Priority area. The first is the Increased Technical Service Provider Access Act of 2023, and the second is the Seedlings for Sustainable Habitat Restoration Act of 2023. Now, you've heard of both of these bills already. CCL has lobbied on these, and that is why they have actually advanced quite a bit. Particularly the Increased Technical Service Provider Act, we have been responsible for a lot of the momentum behind the number of bipartisan co-sponsors on the bill since we started working on it back in June. We've done some calls on the bills. We've focused on this a whole bunch, and now the number of co-sponsors is really high, and it might be one of the more bipartisan bills in Congress. And one of our goals was always to get this bill in the Farm Bill. And I can say with a lot of happiness that at least has been partially achieved. Chairman G.T. Thompson, the House Republican chair of the Ag Committee, recently released their first proposal at a Farm Bill, and it actually includes the TPS Access Act, and it includes something very similar to Seedlings for Sustainable Habitat, which that bill, not incidentally, just passed out of committee a couple weeks ago. Now you say, well, if we've already got this stuff in the Farm Bill, why are we still talking about it? Well, it's not done yet. We've got it in one version. The House still needs to mark up the bill. They need to bring it to the floor. It probably will have no chance of passing in the Senate until there's further negotiation. So by focusing on these bills that we've gotten part of the way there, we can now really push them over the finish line. That's when Jen was talking about, like, that near term, we put in the work and they're advancing, and now we can help get them over the finish line by just building up a couple more co-sponsors. Office is still hearing about them because, like I said, it's only in the Republican version of the House Farm Bill right now, and there's still a lot of work to be done. Now let's talk about the specific, what these bills do, just so we get into some of those details. Um, it creates a streamlined certification process for technical service providers to address shortages and get this technical assistance to farmers, particularly when we're talking about all that IRA conservation money, $20 billion that was included. They still need this technical expertise that USDA just doesn't have the capacity to give them. So by helping to get more technical service providers accredited and get them where farmers can utilize them, this will be very important for them to utilize those climate and conservation programs that have now been well funded through the IRA. On the seedlings bill, we can go on to that one. One of the things that, while this seems like such a little bill, one of the things that's been identified in like the idea of really helping to rebuild our forests is, particularly after wildfires, you need to replant forests. It just doesn't necessarily happen. And we don't have significant stocks of seedlings to do this reforestation. And so one of the things that this bill does is that helps build that seedling supply chain. And while I said like some of this was included in this House version of the Farm Bill, we still need to push this concept and make sure it gets over the finish line. It passed by unanimous consent in committee, but there's a lot of things that pass by unanimous consent that then don't make it all the way to the finish line. So we want to keep talking about it. And both of these bills are really important to ensuring the Farm Bill has a really good, healthy forest component.
Perfect. Well, I'm very excited about those secondary asks, and I think someone put in the chat that the TSP increased TSP Access Act already has 28 Republican co-sponsors, 26 Democratic co-sponsors in the House. So we've already made tremendous headway. So I can't wait to see how much more we make in June and get these bills across the finish line. I'm going to talk a little bit about the letters from a trusted messenger. This was an action we gave you all, I would say, a couple months ago now, that I know many of you have been working on to gather a letter, one, maybe more, from a trusted messenger in your district or in your state calling for action on climate. And now the trusted messenger is someone who you think is going to, their voice is going to resonate with your member of Congress. It's going to be someone they respect, maybe someone they know, you know, in the local government, or at least an organization or business that you think their voice would carry some weight with your member of Congress. And the letters were focused on climate action. Some specific climate actions could have been permitting reform. It could have been general climate action. So there were different ways of kind of structuring it based on your member, what you thought was feasible too. And the point of gathering these letters and what we really want to accomplish here, we want you to bring the letter with you to your meeting. And we really want to demonstrate not only that this trusted messenger, this one person, you know, is advocating for climate action, which hopefully that message from that person will go a long way to winning over your member of Congress or showing them a perspective from someone maybe they didn't expect. But also it really demonstrates that our chapters, that our liaisons, our volunteers, all of you folks out on the ground have connections and you're doing outreach in your district. We obviously are a tremendously strong community in and of ourselves here at CCL, but so many of you are doing that outreach in the district. And when we can highlight that to member offices, we're able to show them that we're not just, you know, the 5 people that show up in these lobby meetings every June and every fall. We're a much larger group and we have our tentacles all out in their communities. We're able to touch a bunch of different stakeholders and constituents that they care about. So that's incredibly, incredibly important for us to show. Now, with these letters, you know when's best to bring it up. As you plan your lobby meeting, you'll kind of figure out the flow, but I would suggest you bring it up when it's most relevant. So if it's a letter and it's highlighting permitting reform and that someone, you know, your trusted messenger supports permitting reform, I would include that when you talk about permitting. If it's a general climate action message saying, you know, we've had really bad weather events, we need to take action to prevent these, maybe that's how you start your meeting. You know, maybe you do your appreciation, your introductions, and then you kind of frame the discussion as, here's what's happening in the district, here's why we're here. We want you to take climate action and we'll get to our asks to show you how to do that. So really think about when is it most strategic to bring it up. It could be at the end too. It could be a closing message. But again, if it's policy specific, try to weave it in wherever that specific policy is, if we are covering that in our asks. And the overall message in this, as I mentioned, is that we're not alone in calling for this climate action. There's a specific person that hopefully they know or they respect who feels the same way as us. And there's many, many more. And we're going to keep doing that work to bring those people to our member, to get their voices heard by our member of Congress and demonstrate that this is a community-wide, a district-wide, a statewide, a nationwide, a global issue that we really want to address. And with that, I think we're ready for some final thoughts, Ben.
Thanks, Jen. And I'll try to be brief here because I'm watching the time, and I do want to leave some time for questions, even though we will have a lot more time for questions on Thursday. I know we've covered a lot. But first, let's just talk about how we've already had a positive impact. And this is why we're focusing on some of these things. If you think back, permitting reform had just been in its infancy of being talked about when we started to engage on it, and look at how much has already gotten done. The same thing with Prove It Act. Prove It Act was introduced the Thursday before our June lobby day last year. We started lobbying on it. It's passed through committee with bipartisan majorities, and now it's looking for introduction in the House probably shortly after our June lobby day. So this is a chance to really build up the number of original co-sponsors. But we've already had an impact, and now we can press home what we've already done. The next thing is, people get down on election years and when dysfunction like Congress has been high like it has been. But we have a history of gaining victories, whether or not they're election years or not. A lot of these things will get finally signed into law probably in a lame duck session, but the work needs to be done now to keep Congress working on them. And we might not see results for a couple months, but we do a lot of times see these results, and it's really worth our efforts. And I do like to point out that in recent weeks, we have also seen, while we've seen great dysfunction, we have seen some of the biggest bipartisan victories coming together. Congress has come together to tackle some really big issues. So there is that governing majority that still exists in Congress, and we want to keep pushing them forward on climate. And lastly, Congress always throws curveballs at us. Things could change now, between now and June. Like I just said, even though we knew it was coming, Prove It Act wasn't introduced until the Thursday before our lobby day, but we still pivoted and made sure that we were some of the first grassroots people talking about Prove It. And I'm sure we might get some surprises between now and June, but we'll be ready. But it's a good to note, be on the lookout for any updates from us. And then, of course, we will give you a final update the Sunday before the lobby day.
Today, we hope that you found tonight's training useful and empowering. Know that we are so grateful for you being here. We're really excited about the opportunity to dive in more and engage on this conversation more on Thursday. And as Mindy's put a link in the chat, you can always dive in the meantime to our forums, cclusa.org/forums, where a lot of these conversations are happening. We are really excited to see so many of you in person in DC in just a couple of weeks. But given that we are at the top of the hour, I'm going to unmute all lines so that we can sign off and tell Ben and Jen and Mindy a big thank you. Thank you all, and we'll see you Thursday.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Great job.
Great.
Thanks very much, you guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.